Inside one of the largest extermination centres built during the Second World War, over 78,000 people lost their lives. Majdanek was a purpose-built slaughter centre, and it was close to a large ghetto in which many people were locked up inside of. Inside of the camp, thousands of people were sent to their deaths within minutes of arriving, and there were thousands of registered prisoners, and conditions were terrible. The SS guards routinely shot inmates who were too weak to work in the nearby forest or on the edge of the camp's grounds. But Majdanek was liberated by the Soviet forces in 1944, and despite the Germans having blown up partially the crematoria, it was one of the best preserved sites of the Holocaust, and was the first major site liberated by the Allied forces. But the Soviets quickly brought a number of former guards to trial, and they were then publicly executed on a gallows in front of a large crowd. Today we look at the public execution of the Majdanek camp guards. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Majdanek as a camp was incredibly primitive, and the living conditions were truly shocking. Wooden barracks provided prisoners with little to no protection from the weather, and sometimes even more than 1,000 inmates were kept inside of one single barrack. They had no sewage system, and they lacked the basic sanitation requirements, and the lack of water meant the inmates could not wash themselves or their clothes. Fleas and lice lived on the prisoners that caused deadly infectious diseases, and the camp was guarded by dozens of different SS officials and guards. The commandant was the man in overall charge at Majdanek, and then there were different departments of which members of staff belonged to, and there was a women's camp overseen by 28 German and Austrian female guards, but the punishments dished out by them were horrific. The prisoners were kept in a constant state of terror by the guards, and even the slightest violation of the rules could lead to severe punishment and even execution. Inside of Majdanek, the most common form of punishment was being lashed or whipped, which was often performed publicly during evening roll call, and prisoners could be forced to do penalty exercises, pointless and gruelling sport-based activity, to humiliate, tire them out, and punish them for minor infringements of the camp's rules. Prisoners also faced being hanged on the pole from their wrists and arms, but some inmates were even drowned in the sewage pits or thrown into the fire basins, as well as being maimed by dogs owned by the SS guards. Public executions were carried out at roll call and were performed upon serial rule breakers and those who had tried to escape the camp. One former prisoner said that, during work, the SS men beat up prisoners mercilessly, inhumanly, and for no reason. They were like wild beasts, and having found their victim, ordered him to present his backside and beat him with a whip or a stick, usually until the stick broke. The victim screamed only after the first blows. Afterwards he fell unconscious, and the SS man then kicked at the ribs, the face and the most sensitive parts of the man's body. And finally convinced that the victim was at the end of his strength, he ordered another to pour one pail of water after the other over the beaten person until he woke up and got up. Another customary SS habit was to kick an inmate with a heavy boot. The inmate was forced to stand to attention, and all whilst the SS man kicked him until he broke some bones. People who stood near enough to such a victim often heard the breaking of bones. The pain was so terrible that people receiving that treatment died in agony. It was one of the largest camps and had 7 gas chambers, 2 wooden gallows, and many more places where prisoners were slaughtered. Many were deported to the camp, and they were gassed inside of the killing centre, and this was often done in plain view of other prisoners, and also many prisoners were shot by execution squads. The bodies were then buried to begin with in mass graves, but they would later be exhumed and burned, but then a crematoria was made in which different ovens dealt with the clean-up process. Inside of Majdanek, the most notorious and prolific executions were carried out on one day, with 18,400 people being slaughtered in one single day, 24 hours, on the 3rd of November 1943. It was a sight of untold horror and evil, but in late July 1944, the Soviet Red Army were quickly advancing towards Lublin, and the Polish city where Majdanek was found, and the SS authorities then ordered a very quick evacuation of the camp, and then the destruction of the site. Because of the speed of the evacuation, this was only partially performed, and Majdanek would, when it was liberated, be one of the best preserved camps of the Holocaust, due to the actions of Deputy Commandant Anton Furnace, who could not blow up specific parts of the camp. As mentioned, it's believed that 78,000 people died inside of Majdanek, and there are many more whom it's believed perished within the camp. After the camp was taken over, some of the Nazi guards who were captured working at Majdanek were then brought to trial. The first Majdanek trial, as it was known, was arranged and took place before the Soviet Polish Special Criminal Court following the camp's liberation. Brought to trial were 6 members of staff who worked there: SS Deputy Commandant Anton Furnace, SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Gerstenmaier, SS Oberscharführer Hermann Vogel, Capo Edmund Perlmann, SS Rottenführer Theodor Schürlen, and Capo Heinrich Stalp. These trials took place while the war was still going on, and it was performed to bring some of the men who were guilty of terrible crimes at the camp to justice. It was arranged so quick that it's believed that it would convince those living in the region that the Soviets, who were trying the Nazi war criminals, were the good ones, and who would oversee justice being carried out. The men who worked at Majdanek were all sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, and some prisoners testified about what happened inside of the camp. 4 months after the liberation of Majdanek, the men had been found guilty, and they were then, following their death sentence being proclaimed, taken back to prison for the execution arrangements to take place. Now the Soviets chose a specific spot for the executions of the former guards of Majdanek to take place at that would have maximum effect in terms of punishing these men and also in showing people that justice was being carried out. For this, the Soviets chose for the men to be executed inside the former camp of Majdanek, the very place where they caused so much terror and suffering. One of the men, Capo Edmund Perlmann, took his own life before the executions, but on the 3rd of December 1944, the former guards of Majdanek were taken to the concentration and extermination camp for their deaths. It was heavily publicised in the local region what would happen to these men, and because of this a large crowd had gathered inside of Majdanek. Many Soviet officials stood around to keep a check on the proceedings, and local people flooded into the gates of the camp to witness the executions. There were even many people stood watching in the former guard towers in which SS sentries would keep an eye on the prisoners of the camp from. A large gallows structure had been created, and this was huge. It would have been probably over 5 to 6 metres tall, and on the crossbeam there were 2 fixings for the nooses to be attached to. The condemned former guards of Majdanek were then led onto the back of a truck, and they were stood in pairs, to be executed in 2s on each of the gallows. They were then backed up under the gallows, whilst many Soviet officials kept watch, and one read the death sentence of the court, and at length informed the crowd what horrors these 5 men had been involved in doing. After the death sentence was read, the men then had nooses secured around their necks, still while stood on the back of the truck, and the rope was then tightened. When the sign that everything was ready was given, a guard knocked on the roof of the truck, and this informed the driver to slowly move forward, and with this the former guards of Majdanek were then left hanging on the gallows. Anton Furnace, Hermann Vogel, Theodor Schürlen, and Wilhelm Gerstenmaier, along with Heinz Stalp, were all executed in this way, following the first Majdanek trial in a very public spectacle. The method of execution specifically was slow strangulation, as the Soviets did not use a drop gallows or any drop intended to snap the neck of the condemned. This meant that as the trucks drove off and they were left on the gallows hanging by their necks, they would have struggled and kicked for some time, possibly many minutes, before their bodies went stiff and still. Death would have then been confirmed some time after, but to the Soviet officials and the soldiers, they were dealing with horrific Nazi war criminals, and for them it was a large propaganda boost in the local area, as the local people of Lublin, many whom had suffered greatly and who had lost their family, friends and neighbours, saw a few men being punished in vengeance for their crimes. The Soviets later did this also inside of other towns and cities, such as Leningrad, as a number of German war criminals were hanged en masse in a huge public spectacle. For the people of Lublin and Poland, who witnessed the executions of those 5 guards of Majdanek that day, they probably felt that some form of justice was being carried out for their suffering under a long and horrific German occupation. But the Second World War would still rage on for another 6 months in Europe following the hangings, but but the men who were executed that day were known for their brutality and evil. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.